He thought he was untouchable, until a waitress decided whether he would live or walk straight into betrayal without ever knowing why. Maya Brooks kept her eyes down as she smoothed the white linen napkin between her fingers, the fabric crisp against her skin, the kind of expensive cotton that cost more than her weekly groceries, and yet her hands trembled just enough to betray the storm inside her chest. The restaurant glowed in warm amber light, chandeliers reflecting off polished marble floors, soft jazz humming in the background, the kind of place where men in tailored suits spoke in low voices and every movement carried quiet power. And at table 7, Adrian Castellano sat like he owned the air itself, his posture relaxed, his gaze sharp, his presence commanding without effort, a man who had never been ignored a day in his life. He lifted his glass slowly, the red wine catching the light, his attention fixed on the woman across from him, his mother, elegant, composed, her smile perfectly measured, the kind of smile that never revealed what it hid beneath, and Maya felt it again, that cold recognition tightening around her lungs, because she had heard that voice before, not in conversation, not in kindness, but in something quieter, something meant to stay buried. Just minutes earlier, standing by the service corridor with a tray balanced on her palm, Maya had paused when she heard footsteps stop just beyond the kitchen door, voices lowered but not low enough, a single sentence slipping through like a blade through silk, "Make sure he's gone before dessert." She hadn't meant to listen, hadn't meant to understand, but something in the tone made her still, and then came the voice that made her blood run cold, smooth, controlled, unmistakable. It was the same woman now sitting across from Adrian, adjusting her bracelet as if nothing in the world could possibly be wrong. Maya swallowed hard, forcing herself back into motion, because in this place, hesitation was noticed, and being noticed was dangerous, especially for someone like her, someone meant to move quietly, serve silently, disappear completely. But now the silence felt heavier, like it was pressing down on her from all sides. She approached the table again, step by step, every movement measured, every breath controlled, her tray steady even as her pulse pounded in her ears, and Adrian glanced up briefly, his eyes meeting hers for just a fraction of a second, dark, observant, the kind of eyes that missed nothing, except the truth sitting inches away from him, dressed in elegance and speaking softly about nothing at all. Maya looked away first, because that was the rule, because people like her didn't hold eye contact, didn't interrupt, didn't interfere, but the words echoed in her mind, over and over, louder now, impossible to ignore, and she realized with a sinking certainty that whatever was coming wasn't distant, wasn't abstract, it was happening tonight, in this room, at this table. Her fingers tightened around the napkin as she stepped back into the service station, her breath shallow, her thoughts racing, because this was the moment where silence meant safety, where doing nothing meant she would walk out of here untouched, unseen, just another waitress finishing another shift, but it would also mean leaving him there, unaware, unprotected, betrayed by the one person he trusted without question. Maya closed her eyes for half a second, just long enough to feel the weight of the choice pressing against her ribs, and when she opened them again, something had shifted, something quiet but unshakable, as she reached for a pen tucked behind the order pad and pulled the napkin closer, her hand hovering for a moment before she finally began to write. The pen hovered for half a heartbeat longer before Maya pressed it to the fabric, the ink bleeding slightly into the fine threads as her hand moved with careful urgency, each letter small, deliberate, impossible to misread, because there would be no second chance for clarity once this left her hands. "Your mother sold you out. Go now." She stared at the words for a fraction of a second, her pulse loud in her ears, wondering if she had just crossed a line she could never uncross, if this single act would unravel everything she had built just to survive in a city that did not forgive mistakes, and yet the sentence felt heavier than fear, heavier than consequence, like something that demanded to exist whether she was ready or not. Around her, the rhythm of the restaurant continued untouched, silverware clinking softly, quiet laughter drifting through the air, the low murmur of deals and conversations that never reached the surface, and it struck her how normal everything looked, how perfectly ordinary the night appeared while something invisible tightened beneath it, something only she seemed to feel. She folded the napkin once, then again, her fingers smoothing the edges with practiced precision, disguising the message within layers of white linen, turning it back into something harmless, something expected, and yet her hands did not stop trembling, not entirely, because now the decision was no longer inside her mind, it was real, physical, sitting in her palm. Maya exhaled slowly, steadying herself as she lifted the tray again, her posture straight, her expression neutral, every inch of her trained to disappear into the background even as her thoughts raced ahead to what would happen next. She stepped toward table 7, each step measured, the polished floor reflecting the soft glow of overhead lights, and as she approached, she noticed the subtle shift in the air around Adrian Castellano, the way conversations nearby seemed to quiet just slightly, as if the room itself adjusted to his presence, to the gravity he carried without effort. His mother leaned forward slightly, speaking in a calm, composed tone, her voice smooth as glass, her expression warm enough to convince anyone who did not know better, and Maya felt a chill trace down her spine because now she could see it clearly, the contrast between what was said and what was hidden, the ease with which someone could sit inches away from betrayal and never sense it. She reached the table and placed the plates down with careful precision, her movements fluid, controlled, the way she had practiced 1,000 times before, but this time there was something different beneath the routine, something coiled and waiting. Adrian's gaze flickered toward her again, brief but sharp, and for a moment, time seemed to slow just enough for their eyes to meet, and Maya felt the weight of that moment settle between them, because he was observant, she could tell that much, the kind of man who noticed details others missed, and yet even he could not see what was coming unless she forced him to. She lowered her gaze immediately, breaking the contact as expected, her role clear, her place defined, but inside, her thoughts pressed forward, urging her not to hesitate now, not when she had already come this far. Her hand moved toward the folded napkin, the motion subtle, almost invisible, and she placed it beside his glass with the same quiet care as always, aligning it perfectly, as if nothing about this act carried any weight at all. For a second, nothing happened. The world did not shift, the room did not react, and the normalcy of it felt almost surreal, like the calm before something no one else could see yet. Maya stepped back, her breathing controlled, her expression unchanged, but her eyes lingered just a fraction longer than they should have, watching, waiting, knowing that within that simple piece of folded linen sat a truth that could change everything, if he chose to see it. Adrian Castellano did not reach for the napkin immediately, and that was what unsettled Maya the most, the way his movements remained controlled, unhurried, as if time bent slightly around him, as if nothing in the world had ever forced him to react before he chose to, and yet she could feel something shifting beneath that stillness, something subtle but undeniable. He continued listening to his mother, nodding once, lifting his glass again with the same composed precision, but his eyes had changed, just slightly, the sharp focus in them turning inward for a fraction of a second, as if he had already noticed something out of place, something small that did not belong, and Maya felt her breath catch in her chest because she realized he had seen her hesitation, that brief pause when their eyes met, the extra second she had lingered, the kind of detail most people would miss but not him. Across the table, his mother spoke with effortless calm, her tone warm, almost affectionate, her hand resting lightly near his as. She described something trivial, something that sounded like family, like comfort, like trust, and the contrast pressed against Maya's thoughts with growing intensity because she knew what lay beneath that softness, she had heard it herself, and now every word the woman spoke felt layered, carefully placed, like pieces in a quiet game no one else at the table seemed aware of. Maya stepped back into the flow of the room, forcing herself to move, to continue serving, to blend into the rhythm again, but her attention never left table 7, not fully, her awareness tethered to that single folded napkin sitting beside Adrian's glass, waiting, silent, holding everything she could not say out loud. Seconds stretched, then folded into longer moments, and still he did not touch it, his fingers resting loosely against the table, his posture unchanged, but his gaze drifted once more, not toward the napkin, not directly, but near it, as if he were mapping the space without appearing to do so, and Maya understood then that he was not ignoring it, he was choosing when to acknowledge it, controlling the moment the way he controlled everything else in his world. The air seemed to tighten around that decision, invisible but heavy, and Maya felt the weight of it pressing against her ribs because once he unfolded that napkin, nothing would remain the same, not for him, not for her, not for the quiet illusion of normalcy that still wrapped around the room. A server passed by her shoulder, murmuring something about dessert service beginning soon, the word landing harder than it should have, echoing in her mind with a sharp clarity that made her stomach tighten, because she remembered the sentence she had overheard, the one that had started all of this, and now it felt closer, no longer distant or uncertain, but approaching with every passing second. At the table, Adrian finally moved, his hand shifting slightly, fingers brushing the edge of the folded linen, a movement so small it could have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but Maya saw it, and in that instant, everything inside her stilled, her thoughts narrowing to that single point of contact, that quiet moment where choice met. Consequence. He did not unfold it right away, his thumb pressing lightly against the fabric as if testing it, feeling its weight, and then, almost imperceptibly, his gaze lifted again, not to her, not this time, but to the room itself, scanning, calculating, and Maya realized with a sudden clarity that he already sensed something was wrong, not the truth itself, not yet, but the presence of it, the disruption in the pattern he expected, and that was when he finally picked up the napkin, slow, deliberate, controlled, unfolding it just enough for the hidden message to begin revealing itself, one line at a time, and Maya held her breath without realizing it, knowing that whatever came next would depend on whether he chose to believe what he was about to read. The fabric unfolded inch by inch beneath Adrian's fingers, the movement so controlled it felt almost detached from the weight of what it revealed, and for a brief second his expression did not change at all, his face remaining as composed as it had been when he first entered the room, as if the words had not yet reached him, as if they hovered just outside his understanding waiting for permission to land. Then they did. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in a quiet shift that only someone watching closely would notice, the slightest tightening along his jaw, the faint stillness in his hand where motion should have continued, a pause that did not belong in a man who rarely hesitated. Your mother sold you out. Go now. The sentence sat between his fingers, unspoken but undeniable, and for a moment the world around him seemed to continue without interruption, his mother's voice still flowing softly across the table, the ambient music still filling the air, glasses still clinking somewhere behind him, but something inside Adrian had already separated from that normalcy, stepping outside of it, examining it from a distance. He did not look at Maya. Not yet. Instead, his gaze lifted slowly, settling back on the woman across from him, his mother, his expression unchanged on the surface, but his eyes now searching in a way they had not before, measuring, recalibrating, as if he were seeing her through a lens that had just been adjusted by a single, impossible sentence. She smiled at him, warm and composed, her posture elegant, her tone gentle as she spoke about something trivial, something that would have held his attention minutes ago, but now every detail felt different, every gesture slightly too precise, every word just a fraction too controlled, and Adrian listened without interrupting, because listening was what he did best, because power had always come from patience, from observation, from understanding what others failed to hide. The napkin remained in his hand, partially unfolded, the message no longer concealed, and yet he did not react outwardly, did not question, did not confront, because something deeper than instinct held him still, something that recognized the danger of acting too quickly when the truth had only just begun to surface. Across the room, Maya stood near the service station, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the counter, her posture steady, but her attention locked onto him with a quiet intensity she could not fully disguise, and when his gaze finally shifted, just briefly, in her direction, it was not a question he sent, not yet, but an acknowledgement, a silent recognition that something had passed between them, something deliberate. The moment lasted less than a second before he looked away again, but it was enough for Maya to feel the shift, enough to know he had read it, that he had understood at least part of what she was trying to tell him. Adrian placed the napkin back down beside his plate with careful precision, aligning it as if nothing about it had changed, as if it were still just another piece of linen on a table set for dinner, and then he leaned back slightly in his chair, his movements smooth, controlled, his expression returning to something almost neutral, but his mind was no longer in the same place, no longer anchored to the conversation unfolding in front of him. Dessert would arrive soon. The thought moved through his mind with a clarity that cut through everything else, connecting the words he had read with the fragment of timing that now carried weight, and for the first time that evening, Adrian Castellano made a decision without announcing it, without signaling it, a decision that would not be seen until it was already in motion, as he reached for his glass once more, his voice calm as he spoke a single sentence to his mother, something ordinary, something expected, while everything beneath it began to shift in silence. Adrian's voice remained steady as he spoke, the tone smooth, almost casual, the kind of voice that revealed nothing even when everything had changed beneath it, and his mother responded without hesitation, her smile unwavering, her posture perfectly composed, as if the world between them was still exactly what it had been 10 minutes ago, untouched, unquestioned. But inside, Adrian was already somewhere else, his thoughts moving with quiet precision, aligning details, testing the weight of what he had read against everything he knew about the woman across from him, the woman who had raised him, who had shaped the very instincts he now relied on to survive, and that contradiction settled deep in his chest, not as panic, not yet, but as something colder, sharper, something that demanded verification before reaction. He lifted his glass again, bringing it halfway to his lips before setting it back down, a subtle break in rhythm that no one else at the table seemed to notice, but it gave him time, just enough to observe, to watch the way her eyes held his a fraction longer than usual, the way her fingers rested too still against the edge of the table, as if she were waiting for something, not speaking it, but anticipating it. Around them, the restaurant continued its quiet performance, servers moving in practice patterns, plates being cleared, fresh courses being prepared, and somewhere behind him, he heard the faint mention of dessert service beginning, the word echoing through his mind with a clarity that sharpened everything else. Before dessert. The phrase aligned with the message, locking into place with a precision that left little room for coincidence, and Adrian felt the shift deepen, the possibility of truth pressing harder against the version of reality he had always accepted without question. He leaned slightly forward, resting his forearms lightly on the table, his posture relaxed but intentional, his presence still commanding, and he asked his mother a simple question, something ordinary, something that should have carried no weight, but he watched her closely as he spoke, measuring not her words, but the space between them, the subtle timing, the microsecond delays that revealed more than any answer ever could. She responded smoothly, without hesitation, her tone warm, her expression unchanged, and yet Adrian saw it then, just a flicker, just enough to register, the smallest misalignment between what she said and how she said it, something so faint it would have disappeared under normal circumstances, but nothing about this moment was normal anymore. Across the room, Maya remained still, her hands resting against the counter, her breathing controlled, but her awareness fixed entirely on him, and when he shifted slightly in his chair, when his gaze swept the room once more, it was no longer the casual scan of a man enjoying his evening, it was deliberate, strategic, mapping exits, distances, possibilities, every detail falling into place without drawing attention to itself. He reached for the napkin again, not to read it, not this time, but to fold it carefully, restoring it to its original shape, concealing the message once more as if it had never been there, as if the truth it carried could be tucked away just as easily, but the action was not about hiding, it was about control, about deciding what to do next without alerting the one person who might already be waiting for him to make the wrong move. His mother continued speaking, her voice steady, her smile unwavering, but Adrian no longer heard the words, only the rhythm, the pattern, the subtle cues that now felt like pieces of a larger design, and in that moment, the decision he had made earlier solidified into something final, something irreversible, as he placed the folded napkin beside his plate and prepared to stand, not abruptly, not urgently, but with the same calm authority he had carried into the room, because if there was one thing Adrian Castellano understood better than anyone, it was that the most dangerous move was the one no one saw coming. Adrian rose from his chair with unhurried precision, the motion smooth enough to appear casual, as if he were simply stretching his legs or stepping away for a brief moment, and his mother paused mid-sentence, her expression flickering with the smallest trace of surprise before it settled back into composure, her eyes following him with quiet calculation. "Excuse me," he said, his voice even, controlled, offering no explanation beyond what was socially expected, and without waiting for a response, he adjusted his jacket and stepped away from the table, his posture relaxed, his pace measured, but every step was intentional, every second accounted for. The room did not react, not immediately, because men like Adrian Castellano did not draw attention when they moved, they commanded it without effort, and so his departure blended into the rhythm of the evening, unnoticed by most, but not by everyone. Maya felt at the moment he stood, the subtle shift in the air, the confirmation of something she had only hoped for, and her fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the counter as she watched him move across the floor, not toward the main entrance, not toward the restrooms, but along a path that suggested awareness, that suggested he had already begun mapping his way out without signaling urgency. Behind him, his mother remained seated, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, but there was a stillness in her now that had not been there before, a quiet pause as if she were waiting for something that had not yet happened, and Maya saw it clearly, the moment where expectation met uncertainty, where control began to slip just enough to be felt. Adrian did not look back at the table, not even once, but as he passed the service station, his eyes shifted just slightly, enough to meet Maya's again, and this time there was no question in his gaze, no hesitation, only recognition, sharp and immediate, as if the space between them had collapsed into a single understanding. He did not slow down, did not stop, but the look lasted long enough for Maya to feel it settle into her chest, a silent acknowledgement that what she had done had been received, understood, and acted upon. He continued toward the side corridor, the one that led past the private dining rooms and toward the rear exit, a path fewer guests used, a path that offered distance from the center of the restaurant without drawing attention, and as he disappeared from the main dining area, the noise of the room seemed to return to normal, conversations resuming, laughter rising again, the illusion of an ordinary evening restoring itself as if nothing had shifted at all. But beneath that surface, something had changed, something irreversible, and Maya felt it in the way her breathing finally released a fraction of its tension, in the way her shoulders lowered just slightly, though the unease had not left her completely, not yet. Across the room, Adrian's mother remained seated, her fingers now lightly touching the stem of her glass, her eyes no longer following him, but fixed somewhere ahead, as if she were listening for something only she expected to hear, and Maya realized then that whatever had been planned was still in motion, still waiting for a moment that had just been disrupted. In the corridor, Adrian's pace did not quicken, but his awareness sharpened, every detail registering, every sound measured, the faint hum of the building systems, the distant clatter of dishes, the subtle difference in air as he moved farther from the main room, and as he approached the rear exit, he paused for just a fraction of a second, not out of hesitation, but to confirm what he already suspected, that the choice he had made at the table had not only changed his path, but had exposed something far deeper than a single act of betrayal. He reached for the door handle with steady fingers, his expression unchanged, but inside, the truth was settling into place with a clarity that left no room for doubt, and as the door opened quietly in front of him, Adrian Castellano stepped through without looking back, leaving behind a table, a conversation, and a version of his life that would never feel the same again. The door closed behind Adrian with a soft, almost inaudible click, the kind of sound that disappeared into the background unless someone was listening for it. And for a moment he stood still in the dimly lit corridor, the warm glow of the dining room fading behind him, replaced by cooler tones and quieter air, and it was in that silence that the weight of everything finally settled without distraction. He did not rush forward, did not reach for his phone, did not call for anyone, because instinct told him that the first move after truth was revealed had to be the right one, not the fastest one, and so he let his senses adjust, his mind replaying every detail from the last 15 minutes with precise clarity. The message. The timing. His mother's voice. The subtle inconsistencies that now aligned too perfectly to ignore. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself, and then his hand moved, not toward panic, but toward confirmation, pulling his phone from his pocket with practiced ease. He did not scroll aimlessly, did not hesitate, instead selecting a single contact, one that rarely appeared on his screen but was always there when it mattered, and he lifted the phone to his ear, his posture still composed, his voice low when he spoke, carrying no trace of urgency, only intention. "Where are my men stationed tonight?" The question was simple, direct, and the response came quickly, a quiet voice outlining positions, entrances, exits, the standard precautions that surrounded a man like him at all times, but Adrian listened differently now, filtering each word through the new reality forming in his mind, measuring what was said against what might be missing. There was a pause, brief but noticeable, when he asked about the rear perimeter, and that pause told him more than the answer itself, because hesitation in that voice did not happen without reason. Adrian lowered the phone slightly, his gaze shifting toward the exit ahead, the faint outline of the door visible at the end of the corridor, and something inside him sharpened, not fear, not yet, but clarity, the kind that stripped away assumptions and left only what could be proven. "Pull back," he said quietly, his tone unchanged, but the instruction carried weight, final and precise, and when the voice on the other end began to question, he ended the call without explanation. Because explanations could wait, survival could not. Behind him, through the walls, the restaurant continued its steady rhythm, unaware, untouched, and for a moment Adrian considered the distance between that world and the one he now stood in, the thin line that separated comfort from consequence, and how easily it had been crossed by a single piece of folded linen. He turned slightly, his mind returning to the image of Maya Brooks, the way her hand had trembled just enough to be real, not performance, not manipulation, but something genuine, something that had risked more than it had gained, and that detail settled differently than the rest, not as a threat, but as a variable he could not ignore. His gaze shifted back to the door, his hand resting briefly against the cool metal handle, and he paused again, not out of uncertainty, but to listen, to feel the space around him, the subtle absence of something that should have been there, the presence of something that should not. The corridor remained quiet, almost too quiet, and Adrian understood then that whatever had been set in motion had already begun adjusting to his absence, recalculating, shifting in ways he could not yet see, but he had changed the timing, disrupted the sequence, and that alone gave him an advantage. He pushed the door open slowly this time, stepping into the night air beyond, the city stretching out in muted tones, distant lights reflecting off glass and pavement, and for the first time since reading the message, Adrian Castellano allowed himself a single, measured thought that carried more weight than anything else. Someone had tried to control his ending. And someone else had chosen to change it. The night air felt different the moment Adrian stepped outside, cooler, sharper, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the faint echo of a city that never truly slept, and yet beneath that familiar rhythm there was something else now, something quieter, something that pressed against his awareness like a missing note in a melody he had known his entire life. He did not move far from the exit, not yet, instead positioning himself just beyond the doorway where shadows softened his outline. Where he could see without being immediately seen, and his eyes adjusted quickly, scanning the street, the parked cars, the subtle movements that most people would ignore but he had been trained never to overlook. Everything appeared normal at first glance, a couple walking past on the opposite sidewalk, a taxi idling near the corner, the soft glow of streetlights reflecting off polished glass, but normal no longer meant safe, not tonight, not after what he had read. Inside the restaurant, time continued to move forward without him, and for a brief moment, Adrian allowed himself to imagine the table he had left behind, the empty chair, the untouched glass, his mother still seated with that same composed expression, waiting for something that had not happened, and that image settled heavily in his chest, not as grief, but as a realization that something foundational had shifted, something he could not reverse. He reached into his pocket again, not for a call this time, but to silence his phone completely, cutting off any incoming signals that might trace his position, any connection that could be used against him, and the deliberate nature of the action reinforced what he already knew, that this was no longer about suspicion, it was about adaptation, about staying one step ahead of a plan he had not been meant to survive. A faint movement near the far end of the street caught his attention, subtle, almost unnoticeable, a car door closing without urgency, a figure stepping away with the kind of casual pace that blended into the background, and Adrian's gaze lingered just long enough to register the pattern, not enough to confirm intent, but enough to recognize possibility, and that was all he needed. He shifted his position slightly, stepping away from the direct line of the exit, his movement smooth, unhurried, as if he were simply another man stepping out for air, but every adjustment carried purpose, every step recalibrated distance, angles, visibility. In that moment, he understood something with complete clarity, that the message he had received had not only changed his path, it had exposed the timing of everything else, and by leaving when he did, by choosing to trust a stranger over familiarity, he had disrupted a sequence that depended on predictability. Behind him, through the walls, a faint change in sound rippled outward, not loud, not dramatic, but different enough to be felt, like the shift in atmosphere when expectation is broken, and Adrian did not turn back, did not need to, because he already knew what it meant. Whatever had been planned inside that room had reached its moment, and he was no longer part of it. He took another step forward, blending further into the quiet stretch of the street, his posture relaxed, his pace steady, but his mind already moving ahead, mapping his next move, his next location, his next decision, because survival was not a single action, it was a continuous process, one that required constant adjustment. And somewhere behind him, inside a room filled with light and quiet conversation, a plan had just failed without explanation, leaving only silence where certainty had once been, while out here, in the cool night air, Adrian Castellano walked away with something far more dangerous than power. He walked away with the truth. Adrian did not stop walking until the distance between himself and the restaurant felt sufficient, not measured in feet or blocks, but in awareness, in the quiet sense that whatever had been set in motion behind him could no longer reach him in the same way, and only then did he slow, his pace easing as he turned down a less crowded street where the city lights dimmed and the noise softened into something more distant, more manageable. He slipped his hands into his pockets, his posture relaxed to any passing eye, but inside, everything remained sharp, precise, each thought moving with purpose as he reconstructed the night piece by piece, not as it had appeared, but as it truly was. The message had not just warned him, it had revealed a fracture, something deeper than a single betrayal, something rooted in trust that had been carefully maintained until the exact moment it was meant to be broken, and that realization settled heavier than anything else, because it was not about danger alone, it was about who had chosen to create it. He stopped briefly. Near a darkened storefront, the glass reflecting his silhouette back at him, and for a moment he studied that reflection, not out of vanity, but out of recognition, because the man looking back was not the same one who had walked into that restaurant earlier that evening, not entirely. Something had shifted, something quiet but permanent, the kind of change that did not announce itself but altered every decision that followed. His thoughts moved back to Maya Brooks, to the way her hand had trembled just enough to reveal truth rather than fear, to the risk she had taken without expectation, without protection, and that detail remained the only part of the night that did not fit into calculation, because it had not been driven by power or gain, but by something far simpler and far rarer. He exhaled slowly, the cool air grounding him as he reached for his phone once more, this time powering it back on with deliberate care, and after a brief pause, he selected a different contact, one that carried authority but also discretion, and when the line connected, his voice was calm, controlled, carrying none of the weight pressing beneath it. "I need information," he said, "nothing more, nothing less, because details would come later, but for now, understanding mattered more than reaction." He ended the call quickly, slipping the phone back into his pocket as he lifted his gaze toward the street ahead, the path open, uncertain, but entirely his to choose now. Behind him, far enough to feel like another world, the restaurant still stood, its lights glowing, its doors opening and closing as if nothing had changed, but Adrian knew better, because something had changed, something that could not be undone or ignored. He turned once, not to go back, not to reconsider, but simply to acknowledge the place where everything had shifted, his expression unreadable, his eyes steady, and then he faced forward again, stepping back into motion with quiet certainty. The city stretched out before him, vast, indifferent, filled with possibilities and consequences alike, and for the first time that night, Adrian Castellano moved without the illusion of control, only with the clarity of truth. And in that clarity, there was something far more powerful than anything he had left behind. And somewhere, in a quiet corner of a brightly lit room, a folded napkin lay beside an untouched plate, its message hidden once more, but its impact already written into the course of a life that would never return to what it had been, because on this night, a stranger had chosen to speak, and a man who trusted no one had chosen to listen, and that choice had changed everything in a way no one in that room would ever fully understand.